The rift did not hum. It shivered. Ruby stood at the very edge of the platform, her boots inches from a drop into nothingness. Before her, the dimensional tear pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening violet light, casting long shadows against the cold steel of the bridge supports. Each pulse felt like a hammer strike against the marrow of her bones. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the air where the two worlds bled into one another. The steel under her feet vibrated, a low-frequency grinding that suggested the structure was not built for this kind of pressure. She looked down at the gap, watching debris caught in the gravity well spin into the void. There was no wind here, only the suffocating pressure of a space that did not want to exist. The energy flared, illuminating the jagged metal edges of the foundation. She gripped the railing, feeling the metal bite into her palms. The sheer scale of the rift made the world behind her feel small, fragile, and utterly inconsequential. She waited for the next surge, watching the light tear through the darkness, knowing that if the bridge failed, there would be no ground left to stand on. Rain stepped onto the platform, his boots clattering against the metal plates. He did not look at the rift, focusing instead on the light emitting from his handheld tablet. Beside him, Lolly drifted into view, a sphere of soft blue luminescence that cast a steady glow across the control console. The AI rotated slowly, projecting streams of data into the air between the two humans. Rain swiped through the cascading numbers, his fingers tapping the interface with rhythmic precision. Lolly emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime, causing the blue light to flicker rapidly. Ruby watched the AI, waiting for the readout. Rain adjusted a dial, his brow furrowed as he synced his tablet with the bridge's main processing core. The sphere of light expanded, filling the immediate space with complex holographic schematics of the rift. Rain leaned in, squinting at the projected energy density maps. The data streams were erratic, spiking whenever the rift pulsed. Lolly pulsed in return, a synchronized heartbeat of cold logic against the chaos of the tear. They were a closed loop of effort, locked in a silent exchange of measurements and adjustments. Rain glanced at the bridge supports, then back at the tablet, his movements sharp and efficient. He was looking for a variable that would keep the metal from buckling under the strain of the rift's reach. Rain locked his tablet into the central console and stepped back. The treaty had taken 6 months of grueling negotiation, a mountain of paper, and spoken promises that now rested on the success of this single connection. Every clause was a compromise, a desperate attempt to bridge the divide between two worlds that had not spoken in centuries. Yet, as the bridge groaned, the ink on that document felt thin. Ruby studied the support struts. They were bowing under the weight of the dimensional pressure, the steel groaning with a rhythmic, metallic shriek. It was not built for the energy output currently coursing through it. Lolly pulsed a deep, warning red, casting a jagged light over the bridge floor. The structural integrity percentage dropped by 3 points in a single second. Ruby tapped the console, her fingers moving over the interface to dampen the feedback, but the bridge shuddered violently. They were holding a fragile piece together with bolted steel and desperate math, and the math was failing. The bridge was not just a path anymore, it was a trap. Every second they spent debating the logistics of the treaty, the rift widened, pulling the supports further out of alignment. They were running out of time before the connection became a permanent scar across the sky. Ruby turned away from the console, her attention drawn to the edge of the platform. A cluster of glowing vines hung from the support beam, their bioluminescence usually pulsing in rhythm with the forest below. Now, they were dim, sluggish. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from the thickest vine. As her skin neared the surface, the faint, rhythmic light within the plant shuddered. She brushed her fingers against the stem. The glow vanished instantly, leaving the vine gray and brittle. It snapped under the slightest pressure, crumbling into fine dust that drifted into the void. Ruby pulled her hand back, staring at her fingertips. The sensation of the life force draining away was cold, a hollow ache in her palms. She looked toward the bridge supports. Where the machines hummed, the natural world retreated. The energy integration was not just a conduit, it was a parasite. She reached for another strand, watching it wither the moment it touched the metal of the bridge. The bridge was consuming the very essence of her home to sustain its own existence. She stood in the silence of the dying flora, the hum of the nearby processors sounding louder, sharper, and more indifferent to the loss. The transition was accelerating. She realized then that there would be nothing left of the original world by the time the connection was complete. Rain gestured toward the far end of the bridge, his arm steadying as he pointed into the shimmering haze. Thousands of figures stood on the human side, a sea of shadows waiting for the gate to fully manifest. Ruby narrowed her eyes, watching the silhouettes shift. They were not just citizens. They were families, workers, and leaders, all expecting a miracle that was currently tearing itself apart. Rain swiped through his tablet, clearing a dense wall of data to highlight the density of the crowd. He tapped a cluster of markers. The display turned bright white, indicating the sheer volume of humanity pressing against the perimeter. Every one of those thousands expected the bridge to hold. Every one of them had been promised a new world. Ruby felt the weight of that expectation settle in her chest, heavier than the structural stress of the metal beams. If the connection failed now, it would not just be a technological disaster, it would be a betrayal of an entire civilization. She watched the child in the crowd step forward, hands pressed against the air as if testing for the first sign of a path. Rain looked at her, his jaw tight. The silence between them was no longer about the mechanics of the rift. It was about the cost of failure. They were the only ones standing between those thousands and a silent, empty void. Rain stared at the tablet, his thumbs moving in rapid, rhythmic patterns across the glass. The interface pulsed with chaotic red light, mirroring the erratic heartbeat of the bridge itself. He tried to lock the atmospheric pressure levels, but the numbers spiraled, refusing to stabilize. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep the data streams aligned. A sharp, high-pitched whine emanated from the bridge, supports vibrating through the metal floor. Rain flinched, his hand jerking away from the screen before he forced it back. He was sweating now, his breath hitching in his throat. Every time he attempted to adjust the containment, the bridge pushed back with a violent, jarring resistance. He looked down at his own hand. It was shaking uncontrollably, the tremors traveling up his forearm to his shoulder. It was not just the machine that was failing. His own body was reacting to the immense pressure of the integration. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, leaving a smudge of grease on his skin, and leaned harder into the console. He had to hold the link steady. He had to keep the connection from collapsing, even as the strain carved deep, visible lines of fatigue into his face. He gritted his teeth, forced his hand to be still, and pressed down on the interface once more. The high-pitched whine from the bridge suddenly dropped into a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Ruby pressed her palms against the cold steel of the railing. The metal felt wrong, vibrating at a frequency that made her teeth ache. Beside her, Lolly drifted in a tight, agitated circle. The AI's blue glow stuttered, turning a sickly, washed-out violet as data packets began to leak from her core. She spiraled upward, her light pulsing in rhythm with the bridge's erratic hum. Rain looked up, his tablet screen flickering with static. He tapped the display, but the touch-sensitive surface was unresponsive. The air around them grew heavy, tasting of ozone and scorched copper. Small, glowing particles drifted off the bridge supports, dissolving into nothingness before they could hit the ground. The rift itself, once a stable window into the other world, began to warp, the edges curling inward like burning paper. Ruby watched a floating vine nearby turn gray and brittle, its bioluminescence snuffing out in a sudden, sharp flash. The shadows beneath the bridge seemed to lengthen and sharpen, detaching themselves from the corners of the structure. Something was drawing near, and the environment was already beginning to scream in warning. The bridge fell into a temporary, suffocating silence. Ruby stepped away from the railing, her boots clattering against the metal plates. She looked at Rain. He had dropped his tablet to his side, his posture finally slack, the frantic energy of the last hour replaced by a hard, hollow focus. He nodded once, a sharp movement that signaled he was ready. Ruby returned the look, her jaw set, her eyes tracking the final coordinates Lolly displayed in the air. The AI hovered between them, its light now steady, casting long, stark shadows across the deck. They reached the central console together. Rain placed his palm on the activation pad, and Ruby mirrored the move, her fingers interlocking with his to distribute the pressure. They held their breath, waiting for the system to sync. The bridge supports groaned, a deep, metal-on-metal sound that resonated through their palms, but they did not pull away. Rain leaned into the console, his eyes locked onto the rift. Ruby felt the pulse of the energy beneath her skin, a familiar thrum that signaled the threshold was opening. They stood perfectly still, two figures anchored against the vast, shimmering tier in space. Rain exhaled, his gaze hardening as he pushed the final sequence forward. The bridge hummed, a low vibration that climbed into a roar. The roar of the bridge reached a deafening crescendo, then abruptly cut out. The ambient light, reflecting off the steel surfaces, vanished as if a heavy curtain had been drawn across the sky. Ruby looked up, blinking as the natural horizon disappeared into an unnatural, bruised purple hue. The temperature plummeted, turning her breath into sharp, visible clouds. Lolly spiraled rapidly, her internal light flickering from blue to a frantic, warning crimson. But the air around them seemed to swallow the glow. Then, the silence broke. A sound tore through the clouds, high and screeching, like metal grinding against jagged stone. It was not a mechanical malfunction. It was organic, massive, and rhythmic. The wind picked up, swirling debris across the deck in violent, unpredictable gusts. Ruby grabbed a support beam to steady herself as the entire structure swayed. Rain dropped to one knee, covering his ears as the sound grew louder, vibrating through the very foundation of the bridge. Above them, the clouds parted, revealing nothing but a darker, churning void. The air grew heavy, saturated with a static charge that made the hair on their arms stand up. Something was descending, moving with a speed that defied the physics of the rift. The atmosphere groaned under the weight of an ancient, approaching force. The clouds ignited, not with fire, but with the sheer friction of wings beating through the atmosphere. They dropped from the zenith like falling stars, their shapes carving jagged silhouettes against the bruised sky. As they leveled out, the air around the bridge turned white-hot. Ruby felt the heat singe her skin, a blistering wave that smelled of ozone and sulfur. She scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the metal grating. Rain stood his ground for a heartbeat, then staggered as the deck beneath him began to warp, the steel groaning under the sudden thermal spike. The scouts circled in a wide, predatory arc, their movements fluid and impossible. Each pass brought a blast of searing wind that forced the pair to shield their faces. Lolly darted between them, the AI's light struggling to maintain coherence against the overwhelming radiance reflecting off the intruders. The dragons did not attack immediately. They held their position, hanging in the air with a calculated, rhythmic grace that turned the sky into a cage. They were not merely scouts, they were a blockade. Ruby watched the lead creature bank sharply, its eyes fixed on the bridge supports with a cold, singular focus. The domain was no longer theirs. The intruders had arrived to reclaim the threshold. The lead dragon surged forward, its throat glowing with a concentrated, blinding intensity. Before Ruby could shout, a bolt of superheated plasma erupted from its maw. It slammed into the primary support pylon with the force of a falling mountain. The impact was not a crash, but a violent, concussive boom that rippled through the steel floor. Ruby was thrown off balance, her feet leaving the grating as the bridge buckled upward. She slammed into the railing, the metal biting into her side. Beside her, Rain was tossed sideways, sliding across the deck until he collided with a heavy control console. The air filled with the screech of tortured metal and the sharp, acrid scent of vaporized steel. Another blast followed, striking the central span. The entire bridge shuddered, a long, agonizing groan rising from the structure's foundation. Every bolt popped in a rapid, rhythmic sequence, spraying sparks like shrapnel. Ruby pressed her palms against the vibrating deck, trying to find her footing, but the oscillation was too intense. She looked up. The sky was still filled with the rhythmic beat of wings. The creatures were not finished. They adjusted their altitude, Banking for another pass, their focus fixed on the remaining structural points. The bridge was no longer a path, it was a target. The bridge did not just break, it unraveled. A primary support beam groaned, the sound rising to a high-pitched shriek before the steel buckled outward. It snapped with the force of a thunderclap, sending a shower of jagged metal shards dancing into the void. Ruby watched as the walkway beneath her feet simply ceased to exist. She lunged forward, fingers hooking into a remaining tether, her boots dangling over the endless drop. Below, the broken span spiraled into the darkness, a twisting ribbon of light and debris swallowed by the abyss. The remaining sections of the bridge lurched, tilting at a lethal angle. Rain scrambled to reach her, his movements erratic as the floor shifted beneath him like a living thing. Every few seconds, another rivet failed, popping like gunfire and spraying the air with burning dust. The connection to the other world, once a steady path, was now a fractured ruin. There was no stable ground left, only the rhythmic vibration of the remaining supports straining under the weight of the impossible. Silence reclaimed the space between the explosions, a hollow, empty sound that signaled the end. The bridge was falling apart, and the void below waited for the rest. Lolly did not wait for an order. The blue light hovering near the console flared, expanding rapidly into a translucent, shimmering lattice. It surged across the gaps where the steel had vanished, stitching the air with glowing geometric lines. The containment field hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of anyone nearby. It acted as an artificial spine, bracing the broken segments against the gravity pull of the void. Ruby watched the light pulse. It was a fragile barrier, thin as glass, yet it held the weight of the tilting deck. Above them, the dragons banked, sensing the resistance. They descended in a tighter formation, their throat sacs glowing with a renewed, predatory heat. They unleashed a second volley, a barrage of plasma fire that slammed into the blue lattice. The field rippled, absorbing the kinetic energy. Light sprayed outward like liquid fire, painting the surrounding mist in brilliant shades of cobalt. Lolly held the line. The blue sphere at the center of the field dimmed and brightened, struggling to maintain the integrity of the weave. Every impact sent a shockwave through the bridge, but the structure stayed suspended, anchored by nothing but the sheer, focused will of the machine. The containment field shivered. A direct hit from a dragon scout sent a violent tremor through the lattice, turning the steady blue hum into a jagged, erratic scream of static. Lolly spun in the air, her light strobing from cobalt to a sickly, pale white. Data streams, usually crisp and sharp, smeared into distorted ribbons of code that hung in the air like smoke. A secondary surge of plasma slammed into the bridge, and the field buckled, unable to process the sheer volume of incoming kinetic energy. The feedback loop was instantaneous. Sparks erupted from the core of the sphere, cascading outward in a shower of golden embers. Lolly let out a final, distorted chime that resonated through the steel beneath their feet. Her light dimmed, then flared once with blinding intensity before collapsing inward. She vanished. The lattice holding the bridge together dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the sound of grinding metal and the roar of the wind. With the field gone, the support beams groaned under the sudden, crushing weight of their own mass. Gravity reclaimed the bridge. The floor tilted sharply, dumping debris into the dark abyss as the last of the artificial stability vanished. They were alone, exposed, and the bridge began its final, terminal descent. The groan of twisting metal echoed through the void, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots. With a containment field gone, the bridge hung at a precarious angle, swaying like a pendulum over the abyss. Above, the sky burned with the presence of the dragon scouts. They stopped their assault, their wings beating in a synchronized, rhythmic thrum that cut through the silence. They did not attack again. Instead, they banked in a wide, predatory circle, their eyes glowing with a cold, ancient fire. Every pass brought them closer, their heat radiating outward, singeing the air until it tasted of ozone and dry ash. The retribution was no longer about the bridge itself. It had become a hunt. Ruby watched the lead dragon bank, its scarlet gaze locked onto hers. It was a calculated, deliberate movement meant to signal that there would be no mercy. The bridge dipped, a support beam snapping under the pressure, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the beasts. They were waiting. They watched with a terrifying, absolute patience as the steel frame buckled and groaned. The retribution felt heavy, personal, and entirely unstoppable. They were trapped in the center of the circle, watching the dragons prepare for the final strike. The bridge lurched, a violent, metallic shudder that sent vibrations up through the floor plates. Ruby pressed her palms against the railing, feeling the steel grow hot under her touch as the proximity of the dragons intensified. She looked toward the human portal. Thousands of people were packed against the threshold, staring into the sky, oblivious to the encroaching fire. The bridge was no longer a path. It was a conduit for destruction. She traced the structural lines with her gaze, noting how the main support struts were already glowing cherry red, bowing under the immense pressure of the void. Every second they remained, the bridge drew the dragons closer to the civilian sector. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The link was the catalyst. If she kept it open, the destruction would follow them into the heart of the human city. She looked at the control interface, then back at the shifting, unstable horizon. The choice narrowed down to a single, brutal necessity. She pushed away from the railing and stepped toward the primary junction. She had to sever the connection now, even if it meant losing the work of months. The project was over. The safety of the thousands waiting on the other side outweighed the ambition of the mission. She reached for the override, her knuckles white, and prepared to pull the world apart. Ruby lunged for the emergency beacon mounted on the central pillar. As her fingers closed around the cold, textured grip, the deck beneath her feet dropped 6 inches. A massive support beam nearby sheared off with a sound like a gunshot, sending a shower of sparks and jagged steel shards across the platform. She scrambled to keep her footing, boots sliding on the buckled floor. With the bridge vibrating violently, she tore the safety seal from the beacon. She slammed the activation switch. A sharp, rhythmic pulse of light erupted from the device, cutting through the swirling dust and smoke. The air filled with the high-pitched whine of the signal broadcasting into the void. She didn't look back to see if it was received. The structural supports groaned one last time, a sound of absolute failure, and the entire platform tilted toward the abyss. She held the beacon tight against her chest, her other hand clawing at the railing to stabilize her body as the walkway began to snap apart, segment by segment. The bridge was no longer a bridge. It was a ruin falling into the nothingness, and she was the only thing left on it. Rain was still at the console, his fingers flying across the light streams as he attempted to secure the final data packets. The platform tilted another 10 degrees. Ruby sprinted across the buckling metal, the bridge groaning under the shift. She reached him and grabbed his shoulder, but he pulled away, eyes locked on the fluctuating projections. Another plasma strike hit the deck, vaporizing the secondary supports and sending a shockwave that knocked them both sideways. Ruby did not wait for his consent. She slammed her shoulder into his side, forcing him toward the shimmering threshold of the human portal. He stumbled, his hands clawing at the air, dropping the tablet as he lost his balance. She gripped his arm, feeling the heat of the approaching fire, and shoved him with every ounce of remaining strength. He hit the barrier, his body passing through the shimmering light as the floor beneath Ruby finally gave way. She saw him cross the threshold, safe on the other side, just as the gravity of the rift caught her. The metal beneath her boots dissolved into dust. She reached out, but the portal was already shrinking. She was falling, the air turning cold, as the bridge abandoned her to the void. The bridge did not just fall, it disintegrated. The main support pillar, already weakened by the plasma strikes, groaned once before, snapping like a dry branch. A shockwave of blue light detonated from the center as Lolly's containment field finally failed, the stored energy colliding with the structural steel. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched metallic shriek that vibrated through the very air. Massive girders twisted into unrecognizable shapes, shearing away from the frame and spinning into the void. Ruby watched as the walkway fractured, each segment peeling backward like a dying leaf. The bridge was dissolving into a swirling vortex of sparks and shrapnel. Gravity seemed to abandon the platform entirely. Large sections of flooring floated for a heartbeat before they were pulverized by the expanding rift energy. The air turned white with ionized dust, blinding and thick. Every bolt popped, every weld shattered, and the rigid geometry of the construction surrendered to the chaotic force of the rift. The platform surged upward, then violently downward, tearing itself apart in a final, kinetic display of force. Steel groaned, magic flared, and the entire structure vanished into a blinding, silent explosion of light. The light faded into an oppressive, swirling gray. Ruby hung in the vacuum, her body drifting as the momentum of the collapse subsided. She looked for the portal, but it was gone, replaced by a jagged, pulsating tear in the fabric of space. It opened silently, a black maw that began to draw in the remaining debris. She tried to swim through the air, her hands clawing at the emptiness, but the gravity of the rift was absolute. A massive girder drifted past her. She lunged, her fingers brushing the cold, vibrating steel, but the object accelerated, whipped away by the current. The pull intensified, tugging at her limbs, dragging her backward with relentless force. She turned her head, seeing the last fragments of the bridge being shredded into particles. She reached out one last time, her fingers splayed, grasping for a solid anchor that no longer existed. The rift expanded, casting a shadow that swallowed her entirely. The silence of the void rushed into her ears. She felt her feet leave the last pocket of stable air. The grip of the rift tightened, folding space around her, and she was yanked forward, disappearing into the dark, churning center of the unknown. The sensation of motion stopped with a bone-jarring impact. Ruby hit the ground, rolling until her momentum spent itself against a ridge of jagged, oxidized rock. She lay motionless, her lungs burning as she inhaled the thin, metallic air. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. She pushed herself up, her palms sinking into a fine, crimson dust that coated everything in sight. The sky above was a bruised, hazy violet, devoid of any familiar constellations or shifting rift energy. She stood, her balance wavering as she scanned the horizon. In every direction, the landscape stretched out in flat, desolate plains, broken only by monolithic rock formations that cast long, sharp shadows. There were no trees, no hum of technology, no pulse of magic, just the infinite, rhythmic drone of wind whistling through porous stone. She turned in a full circle, her boots crunching loudly in the stillness, seeking a landmark or a remnant of her world. Nothing remained. The horizon was a seamless line of rust-colored earth meeting the dim sky. She took one step, then another, the realization of her absolute, crushing isolation finally taking root in her chest as the wind carried away her ragged, shallow breath. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, bleeding a final, sickly orange light across the plains. Ruby stood still, her neck stiff, watching the sky change. As the last of the warmth vanished, the violet haze deepened into a bruised, ink-black void. One by one, lights began to prick through the darkness. She tilted her head back, searching for the familiar patterns of the northern quadrant, the guiding clusters she had used to navigate since childhood. They were not there. The stars above were wrong. They burned with a cold, aggressive intensity, clumped in strange, erratic geometries that defied every map she had ever memorized. She traced the lines between them, her finger cutting through the thin, frigid air, looking for an anchor point, a single familiar signpost. The sky remained indifferent. The sheer scale of the distance hit her then, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation of falling. She was light years from the bridge, light years from the hum of the portal, and light years from the people she had tried to save. She let her hand drop to her side, her fingers curling into the red dust. The silence of the night was complete, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of cooling rock. She was adrift in a sea of unknown light, and for the first time, she understood that the horizon offered no return path. Ruby needed a light, just a small, controlled spark to cut through the oppressive dark. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the center of her chest where the hum of energy always resided. She pressed her will against the familiar pathways, expecting the rush of heat to flow into her palms. Nothing happened. She tried again, harder, pushing her focus until her temples throbbed and her hands began to shake. Still, the interior was cold, silent, and empty. It was as if a part of her anatomy had been surgically removed. She opened her eyes, staring at her palms in the dim starlight. There was no glow, no residual flicker, not even the faint static that usually accompanied her presence. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her own skin, testing for the burn of resistance that magic always provided. She felt only the dull ache of muscle and the grit of sand beneath her fingernails. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. She was not merely lost in space, she was stripped of the very essence that defined her purpose. Her breath hitched in her throat, ragged and uneven. She was vulnerable in a way she had never known, standing exposed on a planet that did not recognize her, with no shield but her own skin. She dropped her arms, the weight of the realization pulling her shoulders down, and she finally understood that she had to survive this world as a creature of flesh and bone alone. The horizon was a jagged line of rusted iron and shadow. Ruby took her first step, then another, her boots crunching through a layer of fine, abrasive dust. She did not know how far she had to walk, but the stillness of the planet demanded action. She scanned the ground, her eyes searching for the faint, unnatural sheen of conductive minerals. She found it near a crater rim, a cluster of quartz-like shards embedded in the basalt. She knelt, the hard surface biting into her knees, and pried at the stone with her bare fingers. The rock resisted, sharp edges slicing into her skin, but she did not pull back. She worked until a single fragment snapped free. As she held it, the mineral pulsed with a faint, erratic vibration that mimicked the rhythm of a failing heart. It was a ghost of the connection she once had with Lolly. She tucked the shard into her pocket and looked further down the slope. There were more deposits, scattered like frozen sparks across the red expanse. She stood up, her body aching from the strain, and moved toward the next cluster. Every piece of stone she gathered was a gamble, a desperate attempt to build a bridge from dust and memory. She walked until her legs burned, moving with a cold, calculated efficiency, turning the barren landscape into a workshop of survival. Ruby laid the scavenged shards in a wide circle on the flat basalt. She sat in the center, breathing in the thin, metallic air, waiting for the planet to shift its charge. The ground beneath her pulsed with a low-frequency hum that vibrated through her marrow. She reached out, placing her palms flat against the dust, attempting to draw that raw, subterranean force into the stones. The first surge was too fast. It bypassed the crystals and sparked a jagged arc of electricity that scorched the sand inches from her fingers. She recoiled, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she did not retreat. She forced her hands back to the surface. She began to channel the energy in short, controlled bursts, timing her inhalation to the planet's rhythmic thrum. It was a game of patience and immense physical strain. The energy resisted her, twisting away like a living current, forcing her to constantly adjust her posture and grip. She repeated the sequence until the repetition blurred the edges of her fatigue. Her mind narrowed down to the temperature of the stones and the tension in her own wrists. She was no longer trying to reclaim her old power. She was learning to command this harsh, alien substitute. Every attempt required more precision, more force, and a deeper surrender to the planet's unforgiving nature. The work left no room for hesitation. Ruby knelt by the mineral vein, her fingers working the stubborn rock with rhythmic, punishing force. She pried at the jagged edges of the basalt until her skin tore. Small, dark droplets fell onto the red dust, vanishing instantly into the parched ground. She did not stop to bandage them. Her palms were mapped with deep, angry abrasions and raw, inflamed patches where the friction had burned away the calluses. Every time she gripped a shard, the pain flared, sharp and immediate. But she used the sensation to ground herself. She pressed her bleeding hands harder into the earth, forcing the minerals to align, ignoring the sting of grit in her open wounds. The bones in her fingers ached from the constant pressure, yet she increased her output, grinding the stones against each other to create the friction she needed for the spark. Her survival was measured in the depth of these scars. She watched the blood crust over her knuckles and tightened her grip until her pulse throbbed in her fingertips. She had become as hard as the planet she walked upon. There was no softness left in her touch, only the relentless, grinding intent to master the energy buried beneath the surface. She reached for the next deposit, her hands trembling, and dug in once more. Ruby sat back on her heels, the silence of the planet pressing in as the binary suns dipped below the jagged horizon. The air cooled rapidly, turning the sweat on her face into a thin, stinging layer of ice. She looked down at the mineral shards scattered before her, their edges dull and lifeless in the fading light. A sudden, sharp gust whipped across the plains, carrying a low, metallic whistle that sounded exactly like the groan of the bridge supports before they snapped. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. For a fleeting second, she imagined Rain standing just beyond the ridge, tablet in hand, his face illuminated by the soft blue flicker of Lolly. She reached out, her fingers closing on empty air, and the hallucination dissolved into the barren, red expanse. She did not know if he had made it through the portal or if he was still back there, trapped in the wreckage of their failed treaty. The uncertainty was a weight heavier than the stones she moved. She stood up, her joints stiff, and turned toward the vast, uncaring horizon. There were no signals, no voices, only the endless reach of the alien sky. She remained there for a long time, watching the stars emerge, wondering if she was the only one left to remember what they had tried to build. The memory of the bridge faded, replaced by the immediate necessity of the ground beneath her feet. Ruby stood and walked to a flat, wind-swept plateau. She cleared the dust with steady, sweeping motions of her hands, creating a circular workspace. From her pouch, she pulled the mineral shards she had spent cycles gathering. She did not throw them down. She placed them. One by one, she aligned the stones in a rigid, geometric grid. She calculated the distance between each point, adjusting for the planet's erratic gravity. The pattern was complex, far more demanding than the intuitive magic she once commanded. She knelt, her body perfectly still, and began to orient the largest shards toward the magnetic north of the planet. Her breathing slowed until it was barely perceptible. She ignored the biting wind and the shifting shadows of the binary suns. Her entire world contracted to the space between the stones. She moved a sharp sliver of ore 3 millimeters to the left, then paused, checking the alignment against the stars above. This required a level of focus she had never needed in her homeworld, where magic flowed without effort. Here, every angle had to be perfect. Every stone was a variable in an equation she was still writing. She sat back, scanned the symmetry, and adjusted the final piece, locking the grid into place. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an architect of the void. Ruby placed both palms against the red dust at the center of the grid. She closed her eyes and reached for the latent energy she had felt pulsing beneath the surface for cycles. At first, nothing happened. The stones remained inert, cold, and unresponsive. She pushed harder, driving her will into the geometric alignment, but the energy surged erratically, threatening to scatter the stones and break the symmetry she had labored to build. Her hands trembled under the strain. She grit her teeth, forcing her heartbeat to slow, and channeled the pressure into the primary stone at the center. The ground beneath her flared with a sudden, sharp heat. The air shimmered, vibrating with a high-pitched frequency that set her teeth on edge. She did not pull back. She held the connection, feeling the raw, unfiltered power of the planet flowing through her arms, scouring her nerves. Her fingers ached, her vision blurred at the edges from the sheer intensity of the demand. Then, the resistance broke. A faint, steady blue light sparked from the center of the dust. It did not glow with the soft warmth of her home, but with a sharp, electric clarity. The light pulsed, illuminating the surrounding rocks and casting long, flickering shadows against the barren ground. She exhaled, her strength spent, as the pattern stabilized. It was a cold, alien fire, but it was hers. She had finally forced the environment to yield. The blue light hummed, a steady beacon against the encroaching dark. Ruby stood slowly, her joints protesting the long hours spent in the dust. She did not brush the grit from her skin. It was a testament to the work she had accomplished. She moved to the edge of the plateau, the wind whipping past her, carrying the scent of dry, metallic air. She looked toward the horizon, where the stars hung like frozen sparks in the void. There was no sound, only the rhythmic pulse of the light behind her. She did not pace. She did not doubt. She stood anchored to the spot, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the vast, indifferent sky. She had no way of knowing if the signal would reach across the dimensions, or if anyone remained to receive it. It did not matter. The act of waiting was her final defiance. She watched the constellations shift, tracking the slow rotation of the planet, her focus absolute. Every fiber of her being was tuned to the horizon, anticipating a shift in the light, a flicker of movement, or a break in the silence. She was the only pulse of life in an ocean of rock and shadow, a sentinel standing guard over her own hope. The cold did not touch her. The distance did not diminish her resolve. She waited, ready for the moment the sky would finally answer.